The moment I spotted the scarf, a chill ran through me, colder than the February air seeping into the car. It was draped casually over the passenger seat of his car, my seat, folded as if it had been deliberately placed there. The fabric was soft, a deep burgundy with intricate patterns woven in gold. It wasn't mine, that much was certain, and yet it sat there bold and unapologetic, as if daring me to question it. I picked it up, holding it between my fingers like it might burn me. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to recall if it could belong to anyone else. Someone we knew. Someone who might have left it here by accident. But no name or face came to mind. When he slid into the car, his easy smile faltered the moment he saw the scarf in my lap. I didn't wait for him to speak. "Whose scarf is this?" My voice was sharper than I intended, trembling ever so slightly at the edges. His response was immediate, almost too quick. "I don't know. Must be someone from work or maybe a friend. Someone probably left it when I gave them a ride." I stared at him, searching his face for cracks in the story, but he held my gaze unbothered, as if this was no more significant than a gum wrapper on the floor mat. Who did you give a ride to?" My questions cut through the silence like shards of glass. He shrugged, his casual demeanor a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. "I don't remember. It's just a scarf, babe. Don't overthink it." Overthink it. My throat tightened, and I wanted to scream at him. But instead, I shoved the scarf into the glove compartment and turned to stare out the window, jaw clenched. The rest of the drive was suffocatingly quiet, his usual jokes and small talk absent. I felt him glance at me a few times, but I didn't acknowledge him. I couldn't. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that scarf on the seat, an intruder in a place that should have been mine. His explanation played over and over in my head. It sounded so thin, so flimsy. Who forgets their scarf in someone else's car? Who doesn't notice it's missing? The next morning, as I sipped my coffee, I resolved to let it go. Maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I was looking for something that wasn't there. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But fate had other plans. Later that day, as I pulled into the parking lot of his office to surprise him with lunch, I spotted her. She was standing by his car, leaning against the driver's side door like she belonged there. Her laugh carried across the lot, as she chatted with someone I couldn't see. And then I saw it, the scarf. My blood ran cold. It was the same burgundy scarf, the same intricate gold patterns. She wore it loosely around her neck, a casual accessory to her polished office attire. The sight of it made my stomach churn. I didn't move. I couldn't. I sat frozen in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations, late nights, unexplained text messages. Suddenly his casual shrug, his dismissive tone, all of it made sense. She was beautiful, confident, poised, the kind of woman who turned heads without trying. And there she was, standing next to his car like she'd done it 1,000 times before. I waited until she left before stepping out of my car. My legs felt shaky as I approached his. The sight of it felt foreign now, like it belonged to someone else. As I stood there, staring at the driver's seat, I wanted to scream, to cry, to tear that scarf off her neck and throw it in his face. But instead, I slid back into my car and drove away. When he came home that evening, I didn't say a word about what I'd seen. Instead, I watched him, every move, every word, dissecting it for signs of guilt. He kissed me on the forehead, asked how my day was, acted like everything was normal. But it wasn't normal. Nothing was normal anymore. That scarf had shattered something between us, something I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. And as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling once again, I realized I wasn't overthinking. I was just waking up. The days that followed were a blur of suppressed emotions and quiet observation. I tried to keep my composure, to carry on as if nothing had changed, but the truth was a constant weight pressing down on me. Every glance at him felt like a dagger to my chest. Every smile he offered felt like an insult. My mind became a battlefield, torn between wanting to confront him and needing more proof. Something undeniable, that he couldn't brush off with another casual excuse. That scarf haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of her wearing it, Couldn't forget the ease with which she stood next to his car. My imagination ran wild, filling in the blanks with scenes I hadn't witnessed but could vividly picture. Her in the passenger seat, laughing at something he said, their hands brushing as he reached for the gear shift. It was a cruel, endless loop in my mind, and it left me feeling raw and exposed. One evening, while he was in the shower, I found myself drawn to his phone. It sat on the nightstand, innocuous and silent, but to me it radiated secrets. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I'd never invaded his privacy before, never felt the need to, but now desperation overpowered guilt. Unlocking it was easy. He'd shared his passcode with me long ago, back when trust was implicit between us. I started with his messages, scrolling through the familiar names of friends and colleagues. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but then I saw a conversation with someone named Melissa. My heart sank. I didn't know a Melissa. The thread wasn't extensive, just a few scattered texts, but it was enough. Her messages were casual but laced with an intimacy that made my stomach churn. "Thanks for the ride yesterday. You're a lifesaver." One read, followed by a winking emoji. Another simply said, "Loved seeing you today. Wish we had more time." I stared at the screen, my vision blurring with tears. There was no explicit evidence, no damning confession, but the context was clear enough. This wasn't just a friendly exchange. I quickly snapped pictures of the messages with my phone before setting his back exactly where I found it. That night I couldn't bring myself to look at him. He climbed into bed beside me, his arm brushing mine as he reached for the lamp to turn it off. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft, concerned even. The audacity of it made me want to laugh bitterly, but I swallowed the reaction and muttered a quiet, "Yeah, just tired." The following day I decided to follow him. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad movie, but I needed answers, needed to see the truth with my own eyes. I left work early, parked a few blocks away from his office and waited. Hours passed and doubt began to creep in. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was losing my mind. But then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw him. He exited the building with her. Melissa. She was wearing the same burgundy scarf, her arm brushing against his as they walked to his car. They stood by the driver's side, talking, laughing, oblivious to the world around them. I watched as he opened the door for her, a gesture so small yet so damning. She climbed into the passenger seat, my seat, without hesitation. I followed them as they drove off, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. They stopped at a small cafe, the kind of place we used to go when we first started dating. I parked across the street, my heart pounding as I watched them through the window. They sat close, their heads bent together in conversation, their smiles easy and unguarded. He reached across the table at one point, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It felt like a knife twisting in my chest. This wasn't just a fling. This was something deeper, something that had been growing behind my back for who knows how long. I wanted to storm in, to scream at both of them, to tear that damned scarf from her neck. But instead I sat frozen, paralyzed by the sheer weight of my heartbreak. When they finally left, I followed them again, all the way to a small motel on the outskirts of town. The sight of them disappearing inside together was the final blow. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My world had crumbled, and there was no salvaging it. I drove home in a daze, the image of them burned into my mind. By the time he came back that night, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the scarf spread out in front of me. He froze in the doorway, his smile faltering as our eyes met. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He hesitated, then stepped closer. "Babe, what's going on?" I held up the scarf. "This. Melissa. The motel. You want to tell me what's really going on?" For a moment he just stared at me, his face a mixture of shock and guilt. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can explain." But I didn't let him finish. Don't insult me with excuses. I saw you. I know." Silence hung between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally he nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words offered no comfort, no solace. They were too little, too late. I stood, grabbing my keys and walking past him without another word. As I stepped out into the cold night air, I realized I didn't know where I was going, but it didn't matter. All I knew was that I couldn't stay. Not anymore. I drove aimlessly through the dark streets, the city lights blurring into streaks against the windshield as tears filled my eyes. My chest felt hollow, yet every breath was a struggle, each one heavier than the last. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to hold myself together, but the betrayal cut too deep. I couldn't go back. Not to him. Not to that house filled with memories now tainted by lies. Eventually, I pulled into an empty parking lot, my car idling as I rested my head against the steering wheel. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of passing cars. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I knew it was him. I didn't need to look to know that his name would be glowing on the screen, that he'd be calling with apologies or excuses or both. I ignored it, letting the vibrations fade into nothing. What was there to say? He'd broken something between us that couldn't be fixed with words. I thought about the years we'd spent together. The laughter, the fights, the quiet moments that felt like home. All of it now seemed like a cruel joke. How long had this been going on? How many lies had he told me to cover his tracks? The questions churned in my mind, each one more painful than the last. I sat there for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into the car as the engine finally sputtered off. My fingers brushed against my phone, and before I realized what I was doing, I opened the photos of his messages with Melissa. Her words stared back at me, mocking me, each one a reminder of his betrayal. My thumb hovered over her number, a twisted part of me wanting to call her, to demand answers. But what would that accomplish? She'd already won, hadn't she? Instead, I opened my text messages and started typing a message to my sister, Amanda. She was the only person I could trust right now, the only one who might understand. Can I come over? I need to talk. I wrote, my fingers trembling as I hit send. The reply came almost immediately. Of course. Are you okay? No, I wasn't okay. But I didn't have the energy to explain it over text. I started the car again, the engine groaning in protest, and made my way to her apartment across town. The drive felt endless, each red light stretching into eternity. By the time I arrived, my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely knock on her door. Amanda opened it within seconds, her face etched with concern. She took one look at me and pulled me into a hug. What happened? She asked, her voice soft but urgent. The floodgates opened. I told her everything, the scarf, the text, seeing him with Melissa, the motel. By the time I finished, my throat was raw, and tears were streaming down my face. Amanda listened silently, her arms wrapped around me as I collapsed onto her couch. That bastard, she muttered when I finally finished. I knew something was off about him. I just didn't want to say anything because you seemed so happy. I laughed bitterly, wiping at my eyes. Happy? I thought I was. But now I don't even know what was real. She handed me a mug of tea, her expression hardening. You deserve so much better than this, you know that, right? You can't let him get away with this. I'm not going back, I said, the words tasting strange but certain. I can't. Not after what I saw. Amanda nodded, her resolve matching mine. Good. You'll stay here as long as you need. We'll figure this out together. For the first time that night, I felt a glimmer of relief. I wasn't alone. I had Amanda, and for now that was enough. The next morning, I woke to the sound of her bustling around the kitchen. The smell of coffee filled the air, and for a moment, I could almost forget the nightmare of the past few days. But then my phone buzzed on the bedside table, jolting me back to reality. It was him again. This time he'd left a voicemail. Against my better judgment, I played it. Hey, it's me. Look, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But please, can we talk? I need to explain. I made a mistake and I don't want to lose you. Just call me back. Please. I deleted the message without hesitation. His words meant nothing to me now. I joined Amanda in the kitchen, her cheerful demeanor faltering when she saw my face. Let me guess, she said, pouring me a cup of coffee. He called. Yeah, I said, taking a sip. He wants to explain. She rolled her eyes. Of course he does. He's just trying to save himself. Don't let him weasel his way back in. I won't, I said, though a small part of me still wavered. Despite everything, there was a voice in the back of my mind whispering doubts, urging me to hear him out. I hated that voice. I hated that he still had that power over me. Over the next few days, I focused on taking small steps forward. I moved my things into Amanda's apartment, leaving only a note for him at the house. Don't contact me. It wasn't much, but it felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of control. I blocked his number, deleted our photos from my phone, and tried to fill my days with anything that could distract me from the ache in my chest. But no matter what I did, the questions lingered. Why had he done it? Was it something I'd done, or was this just who he was? The uncertainty gnawed at me, making it impossible to find closure. One evening, as Amanda and I sat watching some mindless TV show, she turned to me with a mischievous glint in her eye. "You know what you need," she said. "Revenge." I laughed, shaking my head. "That's not going to fix anything." "Maybe not," she said with a shrug. "But it'll feel good." Her suggestion planted a seed, one I couldn't entirely dismiss. Maybe revenge wasn't the answer, but taking back my power? That sounded like something I could get behind. Amanda's words stayed with me, buzzing in the back of my mind like an unresolved thought. Revenge. It sounded dramatic, even petty, but I couldn't shake the allure of reclaiming something he had stolen from me. My dignity, my peace of mind, my sense of safety in the relationship. He had taken all of it, and I wanted something back. That night, as Amanda fell asleep on the couch beside me, I scrolled through my phone aimlessly. My blocked list included his number now, but I still couldn't stop myself from opening my photo gallery. The pictures of our life together stared back at me. Vacations, dinners, anniversaries. In all of them, he looked so happy, so genuine. I'd loved him in those moments. Maybe I still loved him now, but it didn't matter. Love wasn't enough to cover the damage he'd done. As I swiped through the photos, I realized something. Every image of him was still tied to my phone, to me. My life was filled with him, even in his absence. I couldn't erase that overnight, but I could start untangling myself from the remnants of us. It was a small act of rebellion, maybe even catharsis. One by one, I began deleting the photos. Each swipe felt like shedding a layer of his presence, a step closer to reclaiming my identity. By the time the gallery was empty, the knot in my chest had loosened slightly. I set my phone down and closed my eyes, letting the darkness envelop me. But as sleep crept closer, so did a new thought. What if reclaiming myself wasn't just about cutting him out? What if it was about facing him, taking control of the narrative? The next morning, I woke with a clarity that felt foreign after so many days of confusion. Amanda noticed it immediately as I joined her in the kitchen, her eyebrows raising in curiosity as I poured myself a cup of coffee. "You're up early," she said, leaning against the counter. "You look determined. What's going on?" I took a sip, the warmth steadying me. "I think I need to see him." Amanda frowned, setting her mug down with a clink. "Are you serious? After everything he's done?" "I don't mean to get back together," I said quickly. "I just need closure. I need to look him in the eye and tell him that I know. That I'm done. I don't want him to think he's walking away from this unscathed." Her frown deepened. "Closure is overrated, you know. Sometimes it's better to just leave it all behind." "Maybe," I said. "But I need this. For me." She sighed but didn't argue further. Instead, she simply nodded. "Just promise me you won't let him manipulate you. He's good at that, clearly." "I promise," I said, though the words felt heavy in my mouth. I wasn't sure if I was reassuring her or myself. Later that afternoon, I drove back to the house we'd shared, my heart pounding the entire way. The driveway was empty when I arrived, a small relief that gave me time to collect myself. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of the place hitting me like a tidal wave. Memories rushed in, our laughter echoing through the halls, quiet nights spent curled up on the couch, whispered promises in the dark. But they felt distant now, like echoes from another life. I walked through the house, gathering a few remaining belongings I hadn't taken to Amanda's. The quiet was oppressive, the space too large and too full of memories for me to stay long. As I packed, I couldn't help but notice the little signs of his life continuing without me. An open book on the coffee table, a jacket draped over the back of a chair. He was still here, still living as though nothing had changed. And then I saw it. The scarf. It was lying on the arm of the couch, folded neatly, almost mockingly. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Without thinking, I grabbed it, clutching it tightly in my hand. The fabric was softer than I remembered, and it felt infuriatingly warm against my skin. The sound of the door opening startled me. I turned to see him standing there, his expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. For a moment we just stared at each other, the silence stretching out until it felt unbearable. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low, careful. I held up the scarf. "I came to get my things. And to give you this." My voice was steady, stronger than I'd expected. His eyes flicked to the scarf, then back to me. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Look, about the scarf." "Don't," I interrupted, cutting him off. "I don't want your excuses. I know everything, okay? I saw the texts. I saw you with her. And I don't care what you have to say about it." His shoulders slumped, the weight of my words seeming to land heavily on him. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You didn't mean to hurt me? You lied to me. You cheated on me. And you didn't think that would hurt." He looked away, his jaw tightening. It wasn't supposed to be like this." "But it is," I said, stepping closer. "You made your choices. And now I'm making mine. I'm done, James. I'm done with you, with this house, with everything. I just needed to tell you that to your face." He didn't respond, his silence more damning than any apology could have been. I dropped the scarf at his feet, letting it pool on the floor between us like a broken promise. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door, the weight on my chest finally lifting as I stepped into the sunlight. For the first time in days, I felt free. He no longer had a hold on me, no longer controlled the narrative. This was my story now, and I was taking it back. As I walked away from the house, the crisp afternoon air filled my lungs, carrying a mix of finality and relief. My steps felt lighter with each stride, as though the chains of betrayal and self-doubt were breaking one by one. I didn't look back. There was nothing left for me in that place, not the memories, not the comfort, and certainly not him. The scarf was his problem now, just like everything else he'd brought into his life without considering what it would cost. The drive back to Amanda's apartment was quiet, the hum of the car engine soothing the residual anger simmering in my chest. I replayed the moment I dropped the scarf at his feet, the way his face had crumpled under the weight of my words. It wasn't satisfaction I felt exactly. There was no undoing the damage, but it was something close. A reclaiming. A reminder to myself that I wasn't powerless, no matter how much he'd tried to make me feel like I was. Amanda was waiting for me when I walked through the door, her face lighting up with cautious curiosity. "How did it go?" she asked, handing me a cup of tea as I sank into the couch. I took a sip, letting the warmth settle me before answering. "It's done." I told him I knew everything. I told him I was done. And I left the scarf. Her eyes widened, a small, approving smirk playing on her lips. "You left the scarf? Damn, that's poetic." I managed a faint smile. It felt right, like leaving behind everything he lied about. She leaned back, crossing her arms as she studied me. "So, how do you feel now?" I considered the question, turning it over in my mind. How did I feel? The truth was, I didn't know. There was relief, sure, but also a strange emptiness where all the pain and anger had been. I felt untethered, like I was floating through a space I didn't yet know how to navigate. "Lighter," I said finally, "but also lost." Amanda nodded, her expression softening. "That's normal. You've been through hell. It's going to take time to figure out what comes next." "What does come next?" I asked, more to myself than to her. The life I'd envisioned, the one I'd built around him, was gone now. Every plan, every dream, every moment we'd imagined for the future. It all felt like ash in my hands. Amanda's voice broke through my spiraling thoughts. "Whatever you want it to be," she said simply. "This is your chance to start over. No strings, no lies, just you." Her words settled in my chest, sparking something I hadn't felt in days: hope. It was faint, a flicker of light in the darkness, but it was there. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was my chance to rebuild, to rediscover who I was outside of him, and everything we'd shared. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was something. A beginning. The next few weeks were a blur of small, deliberate steps. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to keep my mind occupied. Amanda and I spent our evenings binge-watching shows, laughing over takeout, and making plans for weekend trips we'd never gotten around to before. Slowly but surely, the heaviness in my chest began to lift, replaced by something softer, something brighter. But the healing wasn't linear. There were nights when the weight of it all would crash down on me without warning, dragging me back into the mire of doubt and anger. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd missed some sign, some warning that could have spared me this pain. Those nights were the hardest, but they were also a reminder of how far I'd come. Each one felt a little less suffocating than the last. One afternoon, while scrolling through social media, I came across a post from a mutual friend of James and me. It was a photo of a group dinner, the kind we used to attend together. And there he was, sitting at the far end of the table, his smile as easy and charming as ever. Beside him sat Melissa, her hand resting casually on his arm. My stomach twisted at the sight, a pang of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't jealousy, not anymore, but it was close. Maybe it was the lingering ache of betrayal, the reminder that while I was picking up the pieces, he seemed to be moving on effortlessly. I closed the app and set my phone down, taking a deep breath. Let him have his smiles, I thought. They didn't matter to me anymore. Or at least, I was learning how to make them not matter. Amanda noticed my mood that evening, her brow furrowing as she sat beside me. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice gentle. I hesitated before answering. "I saw a picture of him today. With her." Her expression darkened. "That asshole. You okay?" I nodded, though the tightness in my chest betrayed me. "Yeah. It just caught me off guard. But I'll be fine." She reached over, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're stronger than this, you know. He doesn't get to live rent-free in your head anymore." Her words echoed in my mind long after she'd gone to bed. She was right. James didn't deserve any more of my energy, my thoughts, my pain. I'd given him enough, far more than he ever deserved. It was time to let go, not just of him, but of the version of myself that had clung to him so tightly. That night, I wrote a letter to him. Not one I ever intended to send, but one I needed to write for myself. I poured out everything I'd held inside. The love I'd felt, the betrayal, the anger, and finally the acceptance. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face, but they felt cleansing, like washing away the last remnants of him. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, a symbolic end to the chapter I'd been living in. And as I climbed into bed, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet certainty that I was going to be okay. I didn't have all the answers yet, didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to move forward one step at a time, into a life that was wholly my own. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of determination. It wasn't a miraculous change. There was no sudden burst of joy or clarity, but it was a shift. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but there. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had control over something, even if it was just how I spent my day. I started small, cleaning up Amanda's guest room, making a list of errands, even heading to the grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner. Ordinary things, but in the simplicity of those tasks, I felt grounded, connected to something tangible. At the store, as I was comparing prices on pasta sauces, I bumped into someone familiar. Not someone I knew well, but a face I recognized. Lauren, a friend of James's from his office. She was one of those people who always seemed cheerful, her blonde hair always perfectly styled, her smile bright and practiced. Seeing her now, my stomach tensed reflexively. "Oh hey," she said, her eyes lighting up as she noticed me. "Wow, it's been ages. How are you?" The question felt loaded, though she couldn't have known. I forced a polite smile, gripping the shopping cart tighter than necessary. "I'm okay. How about you?" She launched into a breezy update about her life. Something about a promotion, her dog recovering from surgery, her plans for an upcoming trip. I nodded along, barely processing her words. My mind was elsewhere, bracing for the inevitable question I knew was coming. "So how's James?" she asked casually, tilting her head. "I haven't seen him around much lately. You guys still doing okay?" The words hit like a slap, though her tone was innocent. She didn't know. Of course she didn't. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. We're not together anymore, I said, keeping my voice as even as I could. Things didn't work out. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, she seemed genuinely taken aback. Oh wow. I'm so sorry to hear that. I didn't realize. It's fine, I said quickly, cutting her off before she could offer more pity. It was for the best. She nodded, though her expression was still laced with curiosity. Well, if you ever want to talk or grab a coffee, let me know. I mean it. Thanks, I said, though I had no intention of taking her up on the offer. As she walked away, I felt a wave of relief, like I'd just passed some kind of test. It was the first time I'd said it out loud to someone outside my circle. We're not together. And though it stung to admit, it also felt strangely empowering. It was the truth, and I was learning to own it. When I got back to Amanda's, she was on the couch with her laptop, typing furiously. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of my expression. What happened? She asked, closing the screen and setting it aside. I dropped the grocery bags on the counter, leaning against the edge as I recounted my run-in with Lauren. Amanda listened quietly, her brow furrowing as I finished. I told her we weren't together anymore, I said, my voice soft. And it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. Amanda smiled, crossing her arms. Good. That's progress. You're owning it. That's huge. Yeah, I said, nodding slowly. It is. The days turned into weeks, and life began to find a rhythm again. I started going to yoga classes with Amanda, rediscovered my love for painting, and even began considering moving into a place of my own. The idea was daunting, starting fresh, alone, but it was also exciting in a way I hadn't expected. One evening, as Amanda and I were sorting through a stack of old magazines, my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen, my breath catching when I saw James's name. It wasn't a text or a call. It was a photo tag on social media. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The photo was from another mutual friend, taken at some party I hadn't known about. James was in the frame, his arm casually draped around Melissa. They were smiling, their faces close, their body language intimate. The caption was innocuous, just a generic comment about a fun night out, but the image said everything it needed to. I stared at it for a long moment, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and something I couldn't quite name. But then something surprising happened. I felt nothing. Not the gut-wrenching pain I'd felt before. Not the sting of betrayal. Just nothing. It was as if my heart had finally caught up to my mind, accepting what I already knew. He was her problem now, not mine. I closed the app and set my phone down, turning back to Amanda. She noticed my expression and raised an eyebrow. You okay? Yeah, I said, and for the first time I meant it. I think I am. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something important. I wasn't healed, not completely. There were still wounds that would take time to close, scars that would remain. But I was moving forward step by step, day by day. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something to embrace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was mine to walk. And I was ready. The days began to blend together in a way that felt comforting rather than numbing. Each morning brought a little more clarity, a little less weight on my chest. I found myself drawn to things I hadn't done in years, painting landscapes from old photos, reading novels that had gathered dust on my shelf, even experimenting with new recipes in Amanda's tiny kitchen. It wasn't about distractions anymore. It was about rediscovering pieces of myself I'd abandoned while I was too busy being us. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes I'd brought from the house, I came across a journal I hadn't written in for years. The leather cover was scuffed, the pages slightly yellowed, but it felt like finding an old friend. I flipped through it, skimming entries from a version of myself that felt so distant now. Notes about weekend plans, hopes for the future, little snippets of poetry I jotted down in quiet moments. At the back of the journal I found a list. It was titled Things I Want to Do Before 35, and it stopped me in my tracks. I scanned the items, each one a mix of ambition and whimsy. Visit Paris, learn to play the piano, take a solo road trip, swim in a bioluminescent bay. My chest tightened as I realized how few of them I'd done, how many I'd forgotten entirely. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped dreaming for myself. Amanda walked in, balancing 2 mugs of coffee in her hands. She set one down beside me, glancing at the journal in my lap. "What's that?" she asked, peering over my shoulder. "A list," I said, my voice soft. "Things I wanted to do before I turned 35. Her eyes lit up, a mischievous smile spreading across her face. "Well, you've got time. Why not start now?" I laughed, shaking my head. "It's not that simple. Some of these things, they feel so far away. Like a different life." "Then make it this life," she said, plopping down beside me. "What's stopping you? You're free now."
No, Thais. No excuses.
If there was ever a time to do this stuff, it's now. Her words settled in my mind like a seed, planting an idea that grew stronger with each passing day. Why not? What was stopping me? For so long I'd let fear and comfort dictate my choices, but now I had nothing left to lose. It was a terrifying thought, and an exhilarating one. The first item I tackled was the road trip. It seemed like the easiest to plan, and it gave me the chance to escape the city for a while. I mapped out a route that would take me through rolling countryside, along scenic coastal roads, and into quiet little towns where no one knew my name. Amanda helped me pack, her enthusiasm infectious as she tossed snacks and road maps into a duffel bag. "You're going to come back a whole new person," she said, grinning as she zipped up the bag. "Maybe," I said, smiling despite myself. "Or maybe I'll just come back tired. Either way, it'll be worth it," she said, giving me a playful nudge. The first day of the trip felt surreal. Driving with no destination beyond the next town. No schedule to keep. No one waiting for me to check in. It was a kind of freedom I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I rolled down the windows, letting the wind tangle my hair as I sang along to old songs on the radio. It felt reckless and indulgent, and I loved every second of it. In one small town, I stopped at a farmer's market, drawn in by the smell of fresh bread and the bright colors of handmade crafts. An older woman selling lavender sachets struck up a conversation with me, her warmth disarming as she shared stories about her garden and her grandchildren. When I told her I was on a solo trip, her face lit up with delight. "Good for you," she said, handing me a sachet for free. "The world's too big to stay in one place. Go see it all." Her words stayed with me as I continued my journey, fueling a newfound sense of purpose. Each stop along the way brought something new. A hidden beach where I watched the sun dip below the horizon. A diner where I chatted with a waitress who'd lived in the same town her whole life. A forest trail that led to a breathtaking waterfall. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't looking back. I wasn't thinking about James or Melissa or the life I'd left behind. I was fully present, soaking in every moment, every sensation. The weight I'd been carrying for so long felt lighter with each mile I put between myself and the past. By the time I returned to Amanda's apartment, I felt like a different person. There was still work to do, of course. Healing isn't a straight path, but I was finally moving forward. I told Amanda about the trip in vivid detail, watching her face light up as I described the people I'd met and the places I'd seen. "You look happy," she said, her voice warm with affection. "Like genuinely happy." I nodded, a small smile playing on my lips. "I think I am. For the first time in a long time." The weeks that followed were filled with more steps forward. I signed up for piano lessons at a local music school. Even though the idea of starting something new felt daunting, I joined a painting class, where I met people who shared my love of art and encouraged me to push my boundaries. Slowly, my days began to fill with color and music and laughter, things I hadn't realized I'd been missing. One evening, as I sat at the piano practicing scales, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. She looked calm, confident, at peace with herself. And then it hit me, she was me. The me I'd always wanted to be, the me I was finally becoming. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was mine. And that was enough. The months passed in a quiet, steady rhythm, each one building on the foundation I had started to create. My life was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what I was finding. Every decision, every step forward was a deliberate act of reclaiming myself. The piano lessons, once daunting, became a source of joy. My instructor, a patient older man named Mr. Howard, encouraged me to find the emotion in every note. "Music isn't just about playing the right keys," he said one day. his fingers gliding effortlessly over the ivory keys. It's about telling your story. I took his words to heart, pouring my emotions into every practice session. On difficult days when memories of James crept in unbidden, I turned to the piano, letting the music carry the weight of my thoughts. It wasn't a cure-all, but it was a release, a way to channel the tangled mess of feelings into something beautiful. The painting classes, too, became a sanctuary. The studio was a converted warehouse with high ceilings and sunlight streaming through tall windows. The other students were a mix of ages and backgrounds, each bringing their own energy and creativity to the room. I struck up a friendship with a woman named Claire, who had a laugh that seemed to fill every corner of the space. She was vibrant and unapologetically herself, and being around her felt like stepping into the sunlight after a long winter. One evening, as we cleaned our brushes after a particularly messy session, Claire turned to me with a curious look. "So, what's your story?" she asked, her voice light but sincere. "What brought you here?" I hesitated, unsure how much to share. But something about her openness made it easy to let my guard down. I told her about the scarf, the betrayal, the road trip, and the slow process of rebuilding. She listened without interruption, her expression shifting between sympathy and admiration. "Well," she said when I finished, leaning back in her chair. "You're a badass, you know that?" I laughed, the sound surprising me. "I don't know about that." "Trust me," she said, grinning. "It takes guts to walk away from something that's hurting you and build a new life. Most people would just stay stuck. But you didn't." Her words stayed with me long after the class ended. I hadn't thought of myself as brave or strong. Most days, I felt like I was just stumbling through, trying to make sense of it all. But maybe Claire was right. Maybe there was strength in the stumbling, in the trying. As the seasons shifted from spring to summer, I began to feel a sense of balance returning to my life. The nightmares that had once jolted me awake in the middle of the night grew less frequent. The ache in my chest, once a constant companion, dulled to a faint throb. There were still moments of sadness, of course. Grief has a way of lingering in the quiet corners of your mind. But they no longer consumed me. They were just part of the landscape, like shadows cast by the sun. One afternoon, while browsing a bookstore downtown, I found myself drawn to a shelf of travel guides. I ran my fingers along the spines, pausing on a book about France. Paris. It was the first thing on my list, a dream I had shelved for so long that it felt almost foreign to think about. But as I flipped through the pages, something stirred inside me, a whisper of excitement, a reminder that dreams don't have expiration dates. I bought the book and spent the evening poring over it, mapping out an itinerary that felt both thrilling and terrifying. The idea of traveling alone to a place I'd never been was daunting, but it also felt like the next step in my journey. It was time to push beyond the boundaries I had set for myself, to embrace the world in a way I never had before. When I told Amanda about my plans, her reaction was a mix of excitement and concern. "Paris? That's amazing," she said, her eyes wide. "But are you sure you're ready for something that big?" "I don't know," I admitted, folding the corner of a page in my guidebook. "But I think I have to try." She nodded, her expression softening. "Well, if anyone can do it, it's you. Just promise me you'll send pictures. Lots of them." The weeks leading up to the trip were a whirlwind of preparations. Booking flights, brushing up on my French, and packing a suitcase that felt simultaneously too full and not full enough. On the day of my departure, as I stood at the airport gate, a wave of nerves washed over me. What if I got lost? What if I hated it? What if I realized I wasn't as strong as I thought I was? But then I remembered the scarf, the betrayal, the tears I had cried in Amanda's guest room. I had survived that. I had rebuilt from the ground up. Surely I could handle this. The flight was long, but when the plane touched down in Paris, a thrill ran through me. The city was everything I had imagined: bustling streets, elegant architecture, the scent of fresh bread wafting from every corner. I wandered through the cobblestone alleys of Montmartre, marveled at the stained glass of Sainte-Chapelle, and stood in awe beneath the Eiffel Tower as it lit up the night sky. One evening, as I sat at a cafe sipping wine and watching the world go by, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. For so long, I had been defined by what had happened to me, by the pain and the loss. But here, in this moment, I was just myself, a woman discovering the world, discovering her strength. I pulled out my journal and added a new entry. Learned to love my own company in Paris. It wasn't on the original list, but it felt like the most important accomplishment of all. When I returned home, something had shifted. The old wounds were still there, but they no longer felt like chains. They were simply part of my story, reminders of where I had been and how far I had come. And as I stood in Amanda's doorway, suitcase in hand, she grinned and pulled me into a hug. "Welcome back," she said. "So what's next?" I smiled, feeling the possibilities stretch out before me like an open road. Anything I want. The sense of freedom I brought back from Paris was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just about the trip. It was about what it represented. I had stepped out of my comfort zone, faced my fears, and come out the other side stronger. That realization stayed with me as I settled back into my life, fueling a determination to keep growing, keep exploring. Amanda noticed the change right away. "You've got that glow," she said one evening as we sat on her balcony, sipping iced tea and watching the city lights flicker in the distance. "Glow," I repeated, laughing. "I think that's just jet lag." "No, seriously," she insisted, leaning forward. "You look lighter. Like you've let something go." Her words made me pause. Maybe she was right. Somewhere along the way, the bitterness and anger I had clung to had begun to fade. They hadn't disappeared entirely. Healing wasn't that simple. But they no longer felt like weights dragging me down. Instead, they were reminders, lessons I carried with me as I moved forward. Life began to feel fuller, richer. I threw myself into my painting, experimenting with bolder colors and abstract forms that mirrored the energy I felt inside. My piano lessons continued, and one evening, Mr. Howard surprised me by suggesting I perform in the studio's upcoming recital. "Me? Perform?" I said, nearly dropping the sheet music in my hands. "Why not?" he said with a twinkle in his eye. "You've come a long way. You're ready." The thought terrified me, but I couldn't deny the thrill that came with it. Performing in front of an audience felt like a challenge, a way to prove to myself that I could keep pushing my boundaries. So I said yes. The weeks leading up to the recital were a whirlwind of practice and nerves. Amanda became my biggest cheerleader, insisting on listening to me play even when I stumbled through the same piece for the 10th time. "You've got this," she said every time I doubted myself, her confidence in me unwavering. The night of the recital, I stood backstage, my hands trembling as I clutched the edge of my dress. The small auditorium was filled with people. Students, families, strangers, and the thought of all those eyes on me made my stomach churn. But then I thought about everything I had been through, everything I had overcome. This was just another step, another moment to reclaim myself. When my name was called, I walked onto the stage, the lights blinding and the applause a distant hum. I sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and let my fingers find the keys. The first notes were shaky, uncertain, but as I played, I felt the music take over, guiding me like an old friend. By the time I finished, the room was silent for a moment before erupting into applause. I stood, my heart pounding, and bowed, a smile breaking across my face. Afterward, Amanda rushed up to me, her face glowing with pride. "You were amazing," she said, throwing her arms around me. "Thanks," I said, laughing as I hugged her back. "I can't believe I actually did it." "That's because you're unstoppable," she said with a grin. "What's next?" "Carnegie Hall." We both laughed, but her question lingered in my mind. What was next? The possibilities felt endless now, the world open in a way it hadn't been before. Over the next few months, I kept pushing forward, chasing the dreams I had once set aside. I took a weekend trip to the mountains, hiking trails that tested my endurance and rewarded me with breathtaking views. I enrolled in a photography class, learning to capture moments in ways that words couldn't. And slowly, I began to think about the future, not as something to fear, but as something to embrace. One day, as I was sorting through my email, a message caught my eye. It was from a gallery downtown, one I had visited a few times during their open exhibitions. They were hosting a show featuring local artists and accepting submissions. My heart raced as I read the details. Could I do it? Could I put my work out there for others to see, to judge? I thought about everything I had faced in the past year, all the moments I had doubted myself and pushed through anyway. This was just another step, another chance to grow. So, I selected a few of my favorite pieces, wrote a brief artist statement, and submitted my application. When the acceptance email came a week later, I nearly dropped my phone in shock. My work would be featured in the gallery, alongside other local artists. The show was in 3 months, giving me just enough time to prepare. The opening night of the exhibition felt surreal. Amanda came with me, her excitement contagious as we walked through the gallery. Seeing my paintings displayed on the walls, surrounded by strangers who stopped to admire them, was a feeling I couldn't put into words. It was validation not just of my art, but of the journey that had brought me here. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing alone by one of my pieces, a vibrant abstract painting inspired by the streets of Paris. A man approached, his expression thoughtful as he studied the work. "This is beautiful," he said, turning to me. "It feels alive." "Thank you," I said, my cheeks warming. "It means a lot to hear that." We struck up a conversation, and I learned that his name was Daniel, a photographer who had a few pieces in the show as well. There was an ease to our interaction, a natural flow that caught me off guard. For the first time in a long time, I found myself genuinely enjoying someone's company, not as a distraction or a means of forgetting, but as a moment to connect. As we said goodbye that night, exchanging polite promises to keep in touch, I realized something important. I wasn't looking for anything, not love, not validation, not closure. I was simply open to whatever came next, trusting myself to handle it. Life didn't feel like a destination anymore. It felt like a journey, one I was finally learning to enjoy. And as I stepped out of the gallery into the cool night air, I smiled to myself, ready for whatever was waiting ahead. Months turned into a year, and my life continued to evolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. The gallery show was just the beginning. It led to more opportunities, small commissions, invitations to collaborate with other artists, even a workshop where I shared my process with a group of budding painters. My days were filled with creativity, challenges, and the kind of satisfaction that comes from doing something that truly matters to you. Daniel and I crossed paths again, as we promised, but what grew between us was different from anything I'd experienced before. There was no rush, no urgency to define what we were. We spent time together, sharing our art, exploring the city, and learning about each other in ways that felt natural and unforced. It wasn't about filling a void or escaping the past. It was about building something genuine, one moment at a time. Amanda remained my rock, her support unwavering, as I continued to navigate the twists and turns of my new life. She was the one who encouraged me to apply for an artist residency in New Mexico, a program that would give me the chance to focus on my work in a completely new environment. The idea scared me, but it also thrilled me. "You have to do it," Amanda said, her voice firm. "This is your time to shine." And so I did. When I received the acceptance letter, I cried, not out of fear or sadness, but out of pride. I had taken risks, trusted myself, and it was paying off in ways I never imagined. Before I left for the residency, I spent one last evening at the piano, playing a piece that had become my favorite over the past year. The notes filled Amanda's apartment, echoing softly in the quiet night. When I finished, I sat in the silence, letting the moment wash over me. This was the life I had built, one of courage, creativity, and hope. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The residency turned out to be everything I needed and more. The vast landscapes of New Mexico, with their fiery sunsets and endless skies, inspired me in ways I couldn't put into words. I poured my heart into my work, creating pieces that felt like an extension of my soul. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace, with myself, with my past, with everything that had brought me to this point. When the residency ended, I returned home to a life that felt both familiar and entirely new. Amanda greeted me with her usual exuberance. Daniel was there with a quiet smile, and I realized that I had found something I hadn't even been searching for. A sense of belonging. Not in a person or a place, but within myself. One evening, as I sat in my new apartment, a small light-filled space I had chosen and decorated entirely on my own, I opened my old journal. The list of things I wanted to do before 35 stared back at me. The ink slightly faded, but the dreams still vibrant. I smiled as I crossed off another item, create a life I'm proud of. I didn't know what the future held, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. Life had a way of surprising you, of breaking you and remaking you in equal measure. And as I closed the journal and looked out the window at the city lights, I felt a quiet, unshakable certainty. Whatever came next, I was ready.